I came to Alaska for the silence. I wanted to escape the noise of my life, but the silence out here, it isn't empty. It listens, and it has rules. I found them written on the walls of this cabin. I thought they were a joke. Now I know they're a death sentence, and I just heard a sound outside that tells me I've broken the first one. My name is Alex. I'm a documentary photographer. Or, I was. 3 weeks ago, I packed up my gear, drained my savings, and bought a one-way ticket to Fairbanks. I needed to get away. From the city, from the noise, from the constant suffocating pressure of a life that felt like it was shrinking around me. I was chasing a story, a project I called The Great Alone, a photo series about extreme isolation in the modern world. I wanted to capture the beauty of places untouched by the relentless hum of human activity. I wanted silence. I was a fool. The journey itself was a process of erasure. First the commercial flight, then a sputtering bush plane that left me on a gravel strip that barely qualified as an airfield. From there, it was a 2-day hike, following a forgotten trail marked on an old survey map I bought online. The deeper I went into the Alaskan interior, the more the world I knew peeled away. The cell signal vanished first, then the contrails of jets overhead. Finally, even the distant sound of engines was gone, replaced by a silence so profound it was a physical presence. It pressed in on you, filled your ears. It was exactly what I'd been looking for. The logging camp appeared exactly where the map said it would be, a ghost town of timber and rust, swallowed by the vast, indifferent wilderness. The official record said it was abandoned in the 1930s after a sudden and unexplained closure. The story was that the company went bust overnight, but the place felt less like it had been closed down and more like it had been fled. Tools lay where they were dropped. Half-finished meals were petrified on tables in the mess hall. 6 cabins, slumped like tired old men, formed a rough semicircle around a clearing. The 7th, the largest, was the mess hall. I chose the most intact cabin, the one whose roof looked least likely to collapse under the first heavy snow. The air inside was thick with the smell of damp earth, decaying pine, and a century of cold. For the first few days, it was paradise. I was utterly, completely alone. I spent my days hiking, taking thousands of photos of the stark, brutal beauty of the landscape. The jagged peaks, the endless sea of spruce and fir, the way the light fell in the late afternoon, turning the world to gold and shadow. I felt my anxiety, the tight knot that had lived in my chest for years, finally begin to loosen. The silence was healing me. It was on the 3rd day, while cleaning my chosen cabin, that I found the first one. I was sweeping away a thick layer of dust and grime from the wall next to the stone fireplace. Underneath, written in what looked like charcoal, were carefully formed letters. It wasn't graffiti, it was deliberate, almost instructional. It read, 1. Do not look outside after the sun has set. The trees enjoy watching, but they do not like to be watched. I remember laughing. It was so perfectly creepy, so fitting for a place like this. I imagined a lumberjack with a flair for the dramatic, trying to spook the new guy 100 years ago. Or maybe some hikers or hunters had used the cabin more recently and left it as a prank. I took a photo of it, thinking it would be a great atmospheric detail for my project, a little piece of local folklore. I dismissed it, stowed it away in the part of my brain labeled quirky but irrelevant, and went about my day. That evening I was at my laptop, backing up the day's photos. The sun had bled out behind the mountains, and the darkness that fell here wasn't the gradual dimming of the city. It was like a switch being flipped. The world beyond my small window ceased to exist, replaced by an impenetrable wall of black. The fire in the stove crackled and spat, the only sound in the universe. That's when I heard the first noise. It was a faint scratching sound from outside, on the wall of the cabin. My city dweller's mind immediately cycled through the possibilities. A squirrel, a pine marten. I'd seen them during the day. It was a wooden cabin in the middle of the Alaskan wilderness. Of course, there would be animals. I cranked up the music in my headphones and tried to ignore it, but I couldn't. The sound was a mental splinter, a tiny snag in the perfect fabric of my solitude, and I found myself acutely aware of the window. My back was to it, and the reflection on my laptop screen showed only the dark interior of the cabin behind me. But I felt it, the vast, unseen wilderness, pressing against that thin pane of glass. The scratching stopped. For a long, blissful minute, there was only the fire and my music. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. My shoulders relaxed. Just an animal, I told myself, feeling foolish for my momentary paranoia. Then the new sound began. It was different. It wasn't the random, frantic noise of an animal. This was quiet, precise, and deliberate. Tap, a pause, tap, tap. It was on the window pane, a sound as distinct as a fingernail tapping on glass. It was a sound that had no business being out there in the middle of nowhere. My blood ran cold. Every muscle in my body went rigid. I ripped my headphones off. The silence of the cabin rushed in, and the sound was even clearer, even more intentional. Tap, tap, tap. It was rhythmic. It was patient. It was a knock. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the methodical tapping. My mind screamed at me to turn around, to look, to confront and debunk the source of the noise. It had to be a branch, blown by a freak gust of wind, even though the air had been perfectly still. It had to be something explainable. But as my head started to turn, my eyes darted to the fireplace. I could just make out the charcoal letters in the flickering firelight. The trees enjoy watching, but they do not like to be watched. A stupid prank, a line from a ghost story. It couldn't be real. And yet, I was paralyzed. My body refused to complete the simple action of turning around. A primal, ancient part of my brain, a part that believed in the things that hunted in the dark, screamed a warning that overpowered all logic. It knew, with absolute certainty, that the worst thing I could possibly do in that moment was look outside. The tapping continued, a calm, steady rhythm on the glass, a question hanging in the dark. It knew I was in here. It wanted me to look. It was waiting. That tapping sound felt like it went on for an eternity. I sat there, frozen, staring at my own terrified reflection on the black screen of my laptop until the sun finally rose. I don't know what was out there, but I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to my very soul, that it wasn't an animal. If you want to find out what I saw when morning finally came, you need to subscribe and hit that like button. Trust me, you're not going to want to miss what the daylight revealed. The night was a void. I didn't sleep. I sat in that chair, a statue carved from fear. My gaze locked on the fireplace as if the flames were the only thing tethering me to reality. Every gust of wind, every creak of the old cabin was the precursor to the tapping's return. But it never came back. The silence that followed was somehow worse, pregnant with the expectation of that sound. It was an active, listening silence. I was a mouse under the hawk's shadow, and the only mercy was that it had chosen not to strike. When the first anemic rays of dawn finally seeped through the grimy window, they didn't bring relief. They brought illumination. The world outside, which had been a beautiful, rugged wilderness the day before, was now a crime scene. Every tree was a potential witness, every shadow a hiding place. I waited until the sun was fully clear of the horizon, a golden shield in the sky, before I dared to move. My limbs were stiff, my neck a column of pain from the hours spent immobile. My first act was to approach the window. My heart hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs, a protest against this stupid, necessary act. I half expected to see a face staring back, or some monstrous shape burned into the frost on the glass. But there was nothing, just the clearing, the other dilapidated cabins, and the endless, silent wall of the forest. The snow on the ground was a pristine, undisturbed blanket. There were no footprints, no tracks, no sign that anything, man or beast, had stood just inches from me, knocking on the glass for what felt like an eternity. The complete absence of evidence was a far more profound violation of logic than a set of monstrous tracks would have been. A monster can be understood, thought, but a phenomenon that leaves no trace, that's a ghost. That's a crack in the foundation of reality itself. My rational mind, battered but not yet broken, scrabbled for explanations. A branch? I had already dismissed that. There had been no wind. An acoustic anomaly? The cabin settling in a rhythmic, improbable way? My brain offered these flimsy shields and I clung to them. I had to. The alternative was madness. I decided then that I couldn't stay locked in this one cabin, a prisoner to a single cryptic sentence. I was a documentarian, a seeker of truth. The only way to fight this creeping dread was to confront it with data, with evidence. I needed to know if the other cabins held similar jokes. Pulling on my heavy parka, I stepped outside. The cold was a physical blow, so sharp and clean it felt like inhaling shards of glass. The air was utterly still. No birdsong, no rustle of unseen animals. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath. I made my way to the nearest cabin, its porch sagging like a broken jaw. The door groaned open on rusted hinges, revealing a scene of frozen chaos. Bunks with rotting mattresses, a rusted wood-burning stove, and tools, axes, saws, peavies, left scattered on the floor as if dropped mid-task. And there, etched into the grimy surface of a wooden table, was the next rule. The carving was rougher than the one in my cabin, done with the tip of a knife. 2. Never let the fire go out. I stared at it. A practical piece of advice in the Alaskan wilderness, certainly. But in this context, coupled with the memory of the tapping, it felt like something more. Not a suggestion for comfort, but a ward against the cold that lived outside the laws of thermodynamics. My gaze drifted to the stove in my own cabin, where the fire I'd obsessively fed all night was still burning. A shiver, completely unrelated to the cold, traced a path down my spine. In the third cabin, I found another. This one was almost a ruin, one wall partially collapsed, letting the snow pile up inside. Behind a sheet of peeling wallpaper, I found a message scrawled in the same dark charcoal. 3. Leave the tools where they lie. They have done their work. I looked at the rusted axe near my boot. Its edge was dull, its handle weathered and grey. What work had it done? The mundane work of felling trees or something else? My project, The Great Alone, was rapidly changing focus. This was no longer about the beauty of isolation. This was about its secrets. I spent the next 2 hours moving from one decaying structure to another, a detective in a museum of dread. Each cabin was a verse in a deeply unsettling poem. Each one held a new rule, a new piece of a puzzle I was increasingly terrified of solving. In the fourth cabin, under a rotted floorboard, I found rule number 4, written on a piece of dried birch bark. 4. If you hear a whistle from the forest, whistle the same tune back. It does not like to be ignored. And in the fifth, scrawled above the empty frame of a missing mirror, 6. Do not speak your own name aloud. The rules were becoming a litany of prohibitions and commands, a bizarre catechism for survival in a place that seemed actively hostile to human presence. By the time I reached the sixth and final cabin, I was no longer looking for quirky folklore. I was looking for a manual, a key. This cabin was small, likely for a single foreman or manager. It was tidier than the others, and on the back of the door, painted in what looked disturbingly like faded brownish-red paint, was the 7th rule I would find that day. 7. Do not eat the red berries that grow by the creek. They are not for you. I documented each rule with my camera, my photographer's instincts taking over. The act of framing the shot, of adjusting the focus, created a thin, professional barrier between me and the mounting terror. I was just observing, just collecting data. Later that afternoon, I decided to follow the faint trail that led away from the camp towards a creek marked on my map. I needed fresh water, but more than that, I needed to feel like I had some agency, some control over my environment. The creek was beautiful, a ribbon of dark, clear water cutting through the snow-covered rocks. And there, growing in a small, defiant cluster near the bank, was a bush covered in the most vibrant, perfect-looking red berries I had ever seen. They glistened with moisture, looking like tiny jewels against the white snow. My stomach rumbled. My supplies were all dried and preserved goods. The thought of something fresh, sweet, and bursting with flavor was an almost overwhelming temptation. But rule number 7 echoed in my mind, a silent, insistent warning. They are not for you. As I stood there, mesmerized by the berries, it happened. A sound drifted from the deep woods on the other side of the creek. It was a whistle, not a bird, not the wind. It was a clear, melodic 3-note tune. impossibly human and yet utterly alien in this vast emptiness. It was a simple, haunting refrain, repeated once, then silence. Ice flooded my veins. Rule number 4. My first instinct was to run, to flee back to the relative safety of my cabin and barricade the door. But the rule was specific. It does not like to be ignored. What happened if you ignored it? The memory of the patient, deliberate tapping on my window, supplied a terrifying possible answer. This thing, whatever it was, had rules of engagement. My lips were dry. My hands trembled so violently I could barely hold my water filter. I took a shaky breath, the frigid air burning my lungs, and tried to purse my lips. The first attempt produced only a weak, pathetic hiss. I swallowed, focused, and tried again. I mimicked the 3-note tune as perfectly as I could. My whistle sounded thin and fragile in the immense silence of the forest. The moment the last note left my lips, the woods fell silent again. But this was a different silence. The previous silence had been passive, empty. This one was active, attentive. It was the silence of a predator that has heard its prey. I had answered, I had engaged in the conversation, and I had the suffocating certainty that I was now being watched by something I could not see. I filled my water bottle, my eyes scanning the impenetrable line of trees, and retreated back to the camp, feeling 1,000 unseen eyes on my back with every step. That night, the paranoia began to fester. I sat in my cabin, the fire roaring, a fortress of light and heat against the encroaching darkness. But it wasn't the darkness outside I feared anymore. It was the integrity of my own mind. Was this real? Or was cabin fever a far more potent and hallucinatory affliction than I had ever imagined? I started talking to my camera, setting it up on a small tripod, a video diary. If I was going crazy, at least there would be a record of it. At least someone might find this footage and know what happened to me. It's day 4, I said to the lens, my voice hoarse, or maybe 5. I found a list of rules, and I think I just followed one of them. I recounted the story of the whistling, trying to make it sound objective, like a field report. But the tremor in my voice betrayed my terror. I began obsessively reviewing the photos I'd taken. I zoomed in on the dark spaces between the trees, the shadows on the snow, looking for something. I didn't know what. My rational mind told me it was pareidolia, the human brain's tendency to see patterns, to see faces in random shapes, and I found them. Everywhere. A knot on a tree that looked like a screaming mouth. The way a cluster of fallen branches resembled a skeletal hand. A shadow that stretched from a rock at an angle that seemed geometrically wrong. Each one taken alone was explainable, but together they formed a mosaic of malice. The world outside my cabin was watching me, and I had the pictures to prove it. The final, definitive proof, however, came from the video diary I had just recorded. I was playing it back, listening to the sound of my own unraveling sanity, when I heard it. Underneath my own strained voice, there was another sound. A whisper. It was incredibly faint, almost subliminal, like the hiss of static on a bad recording. My hands shook as I plugged my headphones into the laptop and imported the audio file into my editing software. I isolated the frequency range of the whisper and amplified it, looping the short segment over and over. My blood turned to ice. It wasn't static. It was a voice. A dry, rasping, inhuman sound forming a single, distinct word. It was a name. A name that had no business being in the Alaskan wilderness. A name that no stranger could possibly know. A name that belonged to the one person who represented everything I had left behind. The very reason I had sought this solitude in the first place. The whisper was repeating the name of my younger sister, Chloe. The name hit me like a physical blow, knocking the air from my lungs and the strength from my legs. Chloe. It wasn't just a name. It was a 12-volume encyclopedia of shared memories, whispered secrets, and a fractured relationship I had crossed a continent to forget. I'd come to this godforsaken wasteland to escape the complexities of my life, chief among them the bitter, unresolved argument that had been my last conversation with my sister. And now, in the heart of a silence that should have been pristine and anonymous, that very complexity had found me. The entity in these woods, this whispering, tapping, whistling thing, hadn't just picked a random name from the ether. It had reached into my soul, past the layers of grief for my parents and my own professional failures, and pulled out the one name that would wound me most deeply. The immediate aftermath was a storm of panicked denial. The recording had to be corrupted. It was audio pareidolia, my own desperate mind projecting a familiar sound onto random static. I listened to the amplified whisper 100 times. My ears pressed so hard against the headphones they ached, but there was no ambiguity. The sibilant ch, the soft L, the rising vowel at the end. It was her name. The thing in the forest knew my sister. The implications of that were staggering, a cascade of impossible questions. How? Why? Was this a spirit? An alien intelligence? A psychological projection of my own guilt? The walls of my sanity, already cracked, began to crumble into dust. Fear is a paralytic, but terror is a catalyst. The passive dread of the past few days evaporated, replaced by a frantic, desperate need for answers. I was no longer a passive observer of this phenomenon. I was its target. My project, my quest for solitude, was a laughable memory. This was now about understanding my enemy. If this place held a malevolent intelligence, it stood to reason that the men who had lived and presumably died here must have known something. They left the rules. They must have left more. My search began in the foreman's cabin, the one with the rule painted in that unsettling reddish brown. It felt like the nerve center of the camp. Armed with a crowbar from the tool shed, ignoring the chill that Rule 3, leave the tools where they lie, sent through me, I started to tear the place apart. I was a man possessed, ripping up floorboards, prying panels from walls, my actions fueled by a terror so profound it felt like rage. I overturned the rotting bunk, smashed the dilapidated crate that served as a nightstand, my breath misting in the frigid air. For hours I found nothing but rat droppings and decay. Despair began to set in. Maybe this was it. Maybe the rules were all they had left, a final, cryptic warning without an explanation. I was about to give up when my foot went through a section of the floor near the chimney. It wasn't rot. The boards had been cut. My heart leapt. With renewed vigor, I cleared away the debris and pulled up the sawn planks. Beneath them, nestled in a small, stone-lined hollow, was a metal box, rusted but intact. And inside that box, wrapped in oilcloth, was a thick, leather-bound book, a foreman's logbook. I took it back to my cabin, my sanctuary, and placed it on the table like a holy relic. The fire was roaring, a defiance against the encroaching twilight. My hands trembled as I opened the cover. The first few pages were exactly what I expected, meticulous, cursive script detailing timber yields, supply orders, payroll disputes, and weather observations. The foreman's name was Elias Thorne. His voice, preserved in ink, was that of a practical, stern, and capable man. The entries chronicled the establishment of the camp, the brutal labor, the small victories against the wilderness. I skimmed forward, weeks, then months. Then I found the first crack in the mundane reality, October 12, 1932. Another man lost his nerve today. Young Fincher claimed something was calling his name from the trees at night, sounding just like his wife back in Michigan. The men are on edge. The isolation is a heavy beast and it preys on the weak-minded. I gave him a double ration of whiskey and assigned him to the mess hall. He needs to be around others. My blood ran cold. Sounding just like his wife, I read on, my sense of kinship with this man from a century ago growing with every word. October 29th, 1932. We lost Larson. He'd been complaining for a week about a tapping on his window every night, like a branch, but there was never any wind. He was on edge, barely sleeping. Last night he stormed out with a lantern, shouting that he was going to chop down whatever damned tree was doing it. We found his lantern this morning, smashed at the edge of the clearing. Of him there is no sign. We searched all day, the tracks just stop. It's impossible. The men are spooked. I have instituted a new camp protocol. After sundown, no one leaves their cabin, no exceptions. I'm calling it Rule 1. There it was, not a prank, not a piece of folklore. It was a protocol born from death. Thorne wasn't writing ghost stories. He was writing a safety manual. I flipped through the pages, a sickening sense of validation washing over me. The logbook became a catalogue of horrors, a record of Thorne's desperate attempt to codify the laws of this malevolent place. November 18th, 1932. The whistling has started again, a simple tune that drifts from the woods at dusk. A few of the new men ignored it. They fell ill the next day, a wasting sickness that baffled me. They were dead within a week. Dubois, a French-Canadian, claimed it was a lure, a spirit that demands acknowledgement. On a hunch, I ordered the next man who heard it, a boy named Miller, to whistle the tune back. He did. The whistling from the woods stopped, and Miller remains healthy. It is a terrifying thought, but it seems we must engage with it on its own terms. Rule 4 is now in effect. December 7th, 1932. Marcus broke the first rule. He was a good man, but proud. He refused to be scared of shadows. He said he saw something moving between the trees and was going to face it. He opened his door and stared out into the darkness for a long time. We tried to pull him back, but he fought us off. This morning, we found him. He was standing at the tree line, frozen solid. His body was untouched, his face a mask of utter horror. But his eyes were gone. Not clawed out. They were just absent. Two perfectly empty, bloodless sockets. It took 4 men to bring his body back. The thing in the woods did not want to be watched. I had to stop reading. I felt physically ill. I stumbled to the cabin door, gasping for air, my mind reeling. This wasn't just happening to me. It was a pattern, a century-old nightmare that had simply been waiting for a new cast of characters. The rules were a shield, forged in blood and terror by men who had paid the ultimate price for their knowledge. And I, in my ignorance, had been blithely stepping around the tripwires of a supernatural war zone. As I stood there, leaning against the rough-hewn door, a new sound reached me. It was not a tap or a whistle or a whisper of static. It was a voice, a woman's voice, soft and gentle, full of a love so profound it ached in my chest. It came from just outside the door. "Alex? Honey, is that you?" I froze. Every hair on my body stood on end. I knew that voice better than my own. It was the voice I hadn't heard in 5 years, the voice that I still heard in my dreams, the voice of my mother. "Alex, I'm so cold," the voice cooed, a heartbreaking tremor in its tone. "I got lost. Please, sweetie, open the door. I need to get warm." My logical mind screamed, "It's impossible. She's gone. It's a trick. It's the thing from the woods. It knows her name. It knows Chloe's. It knows everything." But logic is a fragile thing against the raw, desperate power of grief. My hand, acting of its own accord, reached for the iron latch on the door. A part of me, a childish, heartbroken part, wanted it to be real more than anything in the world. I wanted to open the door and have my mother be there. "Please, Alex," the voice pleaded, closer now, right against the wood. "Don't you love me?" The image of Marcus standing frozen at the tree line with empty sockets flashed through my mind. The logbook, Thorne's warnings. It was my anchor in a sea of emotional manipulation. This thing was a predator, and it was using my deepest attachments as bait. "You're not my mother," I whispered, my voice cracking, tears streaming down my face. There was a long silence from the other side of the door. Then the voice changed. The warmth, the love, it all curdled, twisting into something venomous and ancient. "No," it hissed, the sound no longer human, but a dry rustle like dead leaves. "But I have her memories." A wave of revulsion and terror so complete washed over me that I scrambled backwards, falling over my own pack. I lay on the floor, shaking, as silence descended once more. The attack was over. It had failed. But it had shown me the true nature of my adversary. It wasn't just a monster that killed you. It was a demon that dismantled you piece by piece, using your own heart as its weapon. I crawled back to the table, back to the logbook. I had to know how it ended. I turned to the final pages. Thorne's neat cursive had devolved into a desperate, barely legible scrawl. The entries were chaotic, filled with fear and resignation. January 21st, 1933. It won't let us go. We packed the sleds, tried to leave. A blizzard appeared from a clear sky, a wall of white. We are its property now. It feeds on our fear, on our presence. It is a consciousness bound to this place, and we are its sustenance. Then, the final, terrifying entry, February 4th, 1933. There is a way, it told Thomas in a dream. It's a cycle. It always needs a warden, a keeper for the silence, an anchor to hold it here. It won't let the rest of us leave until one agrees to stay. Thomas says he'll do it. He's a good man. He says it's the only way for the rest of us to get home. He is making the sacrifice. May God have mercy on his soul, and on ours. A warden, a keeper, a sacrifice, a cycle. The words hammered into my brain. This wasn't a haunting, it was a prison, and it required a jailer. It was in that moment of absolute soul-crushing despair that I heard it. A new sound, a sound that didn't belong to the night or the woods or my tormented imagination. It was the low, unmistakable rumble of an internal combustion engine. It was distant, but it was real, and it was getting closer. A truck or a snowmobile. Headlights. It had to be. My heart, which I thought had been permanently frozen with fear, exploded with a surge of desperate, delirious hope. Rescue. Someone was coming. I wasn't alone. All reason, all caution, all the bloody lessons from the logbook were incinerated in that single, brilliant flare of hope. I scrambled to my feet, my mind screaming one word: salvation. I lurched towards the window, the one I had so assiduously avoided for nights. Rule 1 was a forgotten ghost story. I needed to see them. I needed to see the headlights that would cut through this oppressive darkness and lead me back to the world. I pressed my face against the icy glass, my breath fogging it instantly. I wiped it away with my sleeve, my eyes straining, scanning the clearing. The engine sound was louder now, seeming to come from everywhere at once. But there were no headlights. There was no truck. There was nothing. Just the silent, snow-shrouded cabins and the black, impenetrable wall of the forest, bathed in the cold, sterile light of a full moon. The engine sound sputtered, coughed, and then faded into nothing, revealing itself as the most cruel auditory illusion yet. My hope died, plunging me into a darkness colder than the Alaskan night. And as my eyes adjusted to the deep gloom, I saw it. A trick of the light, a shadow. No. It was a flicker of movement by the far tree line. Something that had been standing perfectly still, camouflaged by the trunk of a great spruce, had shifted. It was impossibly tall, unnaturally thin, a stark vertical line of black against the gray shadows. It took a single, deliberate, gliding step into a patch of moonlight. I couldn't see a face, or features, or limbs. I saw only a shape, a silhouette that was fundamentally, existentially wrong. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, it receded, melting back into the darkness from which it came. It hadn't been hiding. It had been waiting. It had faked the sound of rescue. It had tricked me into looking. It had forced me to break the first and most important rule, and now it knew that I had seen it. The act of seeing it changed the very texture of the world. Before, I was dealing with sounds, with whispers, with a malevolent but unseen presence. It was a haunting. Now it was a hunt. By looking, I had acknowledged it. I had accepted my role as the observed, and in doing so had given it a substance and a reality it didn't previously possess. The barrier between my world and its world, that thin, fragile pane of window glass, had been irrevocably shattered. I hadn't just broken a rule, I had accepted an invitation. I stumbled back from the window, my body trembling with a new and exquisite form of terror. It was the fear of the specific. I now had a shape to attach my dread to, that impossibly tall, unnaturally slender silhouette. It was burned onto the backs of my eyelids. Every shadow in the cabin now seemed to mimic its form. The coat rack in the corner, the space between the stacked firewood, the very grain of the wooden walls seemed to conspire to recreate that horrifying geometry. The atmosphere inside the cabin, once a fragile sanctuary, had soured. It felt compromised, invaded. The very air was heavy, charged with a static presence that prickled my skin. I could no longer be sure I was alone, even with the door barred and the windows covered. The sounds started subtly, a soft scraping from the roof, as if something impossibly heavy was dragging itself across the shingles. A floorboard groaning in the far corner of the one-room cabin, a corner I was staring directly at, a corner that was demonstrably empty. The whispers returned, but they were no longer faint static in a recording. They were present, immediate. They slithered from the cracks in the walls, curled like smoke from the chimney flue, even as the fire roared. They weren't just my sister's name or my mother's voice anymore. They were my own thoughts echoed back at me a fraction of a second after I had them, spoken in that dry, rustling hiss. "It saw you." A rustle from the corner. "Saw you. You're trapped." A hiss from the ceiling. "Trapped. It's inside now." A whisper in my own ear. "Inside." I was in a psychological echo chamber, my own escalating panic feeding the entity, which in turn amplified it and fed it back to me. Sleep was an impossibility. Every time my exhausted mind started to drift, a sudden sharp rap on the wall next to my head would jolt me back to terrified wakefulness. This was a siege, not just on the cabin, but on my sanity. The goal was not to break down the door, but to methodically dismantle the mind of the person inside it. My only tether to reality was the foreman's logbook. I spent the long, sunless hours of the next day poring over it, not as a historical document, but as a sacred text. I was looking for a loophole, a forgotten clause, a defense against this relentless psychological assault. The rules were a list of don'ts, but there had to be a do. There had to be an action I could take, a way to fight back. I reread Thorne's frantic final entries, his scrawl becoming more and more erratic. He wrote of the entity's growing boldness, of shadows moving inside the cabins, of men hearing their deepest regrets whispered to them from their own empty bunks. It was a direct reflection of my own experience, a century-old mirror to my current hell. And then, buried in a paragraph describing their failed attempt to exorcise a cabin with prayer, I found it. A single sentence, almost an afterthought, that I had missed in my initial panicked reading. McTavish, a Scotsman prone to superstition, claimed his grandfather used to ward off malevolent fae with a circle of salt. He said they are creatures of the earth, but salt is of the sea, a pure and incorruptible substance they cannot cross. We have no salt to spare. The idea is madness, but at this point, I would entertain any madness that offers a sliver of hope. Salt. A circle of salt. It was folklore, a peasant superstition. It was absurd. But in a world where whistling back at a forest spirit was a matter of life and death, absurdity was relative. Hope, as Thorne had written, was a powerful motivator. I remembered seeing crates in the mess hall, the large dilapidated building at the center of the camp. They were likely used for storing cured meats and fish, provisions for the long winter. There had to be salt. Leaving my cabin felt like stepping off a cliff. The clearing, once a neutral space, was now enemy territory. Every tree at the edge of the forest was a watchtower. The air was frigid and still, and I felt the weight of an unseen gaze pressing down on me. I half ran, half stumbled to the mess hall, my boots crunching in the snow, the sound deafening in the profound silence. The mess hall was a cavern of frozen history. Long trestle tables and benches stood in rows, everything covered in a thick mantle of frost and dust. At the far end was the pantry. I kicked open the door and was met with the smell of decay and preservation, a strange, mummified scent. I frantically tore through the rotted shelves and collapsed crates. And then I found it. A large wooden barrel tipped on its side. It was half full of coarse grayish rock salt, miraculously preserved by the dry, cold air. It was real. McTavish's hope was real. I couldn't carry the whole barrel. I stuffed my pockets, my pack, every available container I could find with the precious mineral. As I worked, I heard a sound from the main hall, a single, distinct creak of a floorboard, as if someone had shifted their weight. I froze, my blood turning to slush. "Ah, hello," I called out, my voice a pathetic squeak. Silence. I told myself it was just the building settling. It was 100 years old, on the verge of collapse, but I didn't believe it. The sound had been too deliberate. I grabbed my pack, now heavy with salt, and backed out of the pantry. The main hall was empty, just rows of ghostly tables, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I fled, not daring to turn my back, and sprinted through the snow back to my cabin, slamming and barring the door behind me. I felt like a thief who had just stolen a dragon's treasure, and the dragon was now awake. Inside, I didn't waste a moment. I cleared the center of the floor, pushing my cot and table to the edges of the room. With trembling hands, I began to pour the salt, creating a thick, unbroken circle on the rough wooden planks. It was nearly 6 feet in diameter, large enough for me to sit in with my knees drawn up. The act itself was strangely calming, a ritual that gave me a sense of purpose, of proactive defense. I was no longer just a victim, cowering and listening. I was performing magic. I was fighting back. When the circle was complete, I stepped inside. I sat down on the cold floor, pulling the foreman's logbook into my lap like a shield. I looked at the unbroken white line, a perfect pale barrier against the dark wood of the floor, and I waited. For the first hour, nothing changed. The whispers continued their insidious campaign from the corners of the room. A soft tapping started on the roof, a patient, rhythmic beat. But then, gradually, something shifted. The whispers began to fade, not abruptly, but like a radio signal losing its frequency, dissolving into static, and then, blessed silence. The tapping on the roof faltered, became erratic, and then stopped altogether. The silence that filled the cabin was different from any I had yet experienced. It wasn't the empty, listening silence of the forest. It wasn't the pregnant, menacing silence that followed the tapping. This was a true and profound quiet, a neutral quiet, the absence of threat. It was working. A laugh, a raw, hysterical bark of a sound escaped my lips. The sheer, unadulterated relief was a physical sensation, washing over me, making my limbs feel light. A Scottish lumberjack's old wives' tale, a circle of salt. It was my salvation. I sat in the circle, a castaway on a tiny one-man island in an ocean of supernatural malevolence. I was safe. Exhaustion, held at bay for days by sheer adrenaline and terror, finally claimed me. My head slumped forward, my chin resting on my chest. I didn't mean to sleep, but my body made the decision for me. I drifted into a deep, dreamless slumber, the first true rest I'd had since arriving at this cursed camp. I awoke with a gasp. The cause was not a sound, but a sensation. Cold. A deep, penetrating, unnatural cold that seemed to be emanating from the very floorboards. The fire in the stove had burned down to embers, casting the cabin in a deep, gloomy twilight. But this chill had nothing to do with the fire. This was a cold that felt sentient. I pushed myself up, my joints cracking in protest. My eyes scanned the interior of my salt-ringed fortress. Everything was as it should be. The circle was unbroken. I was still inside. Then I looked for my pack. I had left it right beside me, inside the circle, holding my remaining supply of the precious salt. It was gone. My eyes shot around the dim cabin, my heart beginning to thud a slow, heavy drum of dread. I saw it. In the farthest corner of the room, well outside the circle, lay my pack. It was open, and it was empty. Beside it, on the floor, was a scattered pile of rock salt. My gaze snapped to the wall above the pile of salt. My breath hitched in my throat. There, written in shimmering, crystalline letters formed from the salt itself, was a new message. A new rule added to the lexicon of this place. It wasn't written in charcoal or paint or blood. It was written in my own hope. 14. Thank you for the gift. The sight of those 5 words, gleaming with a faint spectral luminescence in the dying firelight, was the final, crushing blow to the architecture of my hope. The circle hadn't been a shield. It had been a serving dish. I hadn't built a fortress. I had presented a tribute. The profound, tranquil silence I had mistaken for safety hadn't been the absence of the predator, but the quiet satisfaction of it having been fed. The entity hadn't been repelled by the salt. It had been intrigued. It had studied my pathetic attempt at magic, understood my intent, and then effortlessly, contemptuously, turned my own weapon into its trophy. My mind, already stretched taut over the frame of terror, finally snapped. I began to laugh. It wasn't the sound of relief I'd uttered before, but a high, unhinged peal of pure nihilistic despair. I was a rat in a maze designed by a god, and I had just proudly presented the cheese to the celestial scientist observing my every move. The sheer cosmic arrogance of my belief that I could outwit something so ancient and powerful was a joke of magnificent proportions. I had offered a gift, and it had said thank you. The politeness of it was the most terrifying part. This revelation recontextualized everything. I looked at the logbook still clutched in my hands with new eyes. Elias Thorne's final, desperate entry about the warden. It always needs a warden. A keeper for the silence. An anchor to hold it here. I had read those words as a description of a tragic historical event. Now I understood them as a prophecy, a job description. Thomas hadn't been a sacrifice in the sense of being a victim. He had been an offering in the sense of being an applicant. He had taken the post so the others could be released from their service. The camp wasn't a hunting ground where a monster randomly picked off lumberjacks. It was a symbiotic prison, and the entity required a warden to maintain the grounds and, more importantly, to lure in a replacement. And I, Alex, the documentary photographer chasing the Great Alone, had been the perfect candidate. My desire for isolation, my meticulous documentation, my professional curiosity. It wasn't just happenstance. It was a resume. I hadn't found this place. I had been selected for it. I thought back to the old survey map I'd bought online from a dubious seller. The trail that seemed to disappear and reappear. The strangely easy hike to such a remote location. It hadn't been a journey, it had been an induction. My entire presence here was the final stage of a century-long job interview, and I was the only applicant. My laughter subsided, replaced by a cold, sharp-edged fury. The despair didn't vanish, but it crystallized into a new resolve. If I was to be a pawn in this ancient, malevolent game, then I would not be a quiet one. I would not be the next Thomas, the next willing sacrifice to perpetuate the cycle. If my fate was to be the warden of this desolate hell, then I would burn the prison to the ground before I accepted the keys. There would be no next visitor. The cycle would end with me. The plan was simple, primal, and utterly final. Fire. I would become an instrument of cleansing, of erasure. I would obliterate this place and its hateful rules from the face of the earth. I would turn the cabins, the logbook, the very trees that watched with such cold amusement into ash. My movements became methodical, filled with a grim purpose. I was no longer a victim reacting to stimuli. I was an agent of destruction. I searched the cabins not for answers, but for fuel. In the foreman's cabin I found several old tins of kerosene for the lamps, still half full, the liquid thick and pungent. In the mess hall I found bottles of high-proof spirits, likely left behind in the hasty departure Thorne had failed to document. It was a pathetic arsenal, but it would have to be enough. I gathered the pages of the foreman's logbook. This history, this manual of suffering, would be the kindling. Tearing out the pages felt like a desecration and a liberation all at once. The rule about the whistle, the entry about Marcus and his missing eyes, the final, terrible truth about the warden. Each page represented a life ruined, a mind broken. Each one would feed the flames. My own cabin would be the first to burn. It was the heart of my torment, and it would be the heart of the inferno. I began splashing the kerosene over the wooden walls, the floor, the rotting bunk. The fumes were dizzying, a heady perfume of defiance. I set up my video camera on its tripod, facing the door. I had started a video diary to document my descent into madness. It was only fitting that it should record my final act of rebellion. I hit record, not to leave a message, but to have a silent, impartial witness. A final, unblinking eye to watch the end of this place. With everything doused in accelerant, I stood in the doorway, a book of matches in my hand. The air was thick with the promise of immolation. I was ready. I was about to strike the match, to deliver the final fiery judgment on this cursed patch of wilderness. That's when I heard the click. It was a small sound, almost lost in the oppressive silence. But I knew it intimately. It was the sound the tripod head on my camera made when it was being unlocked to pan. I froze, matchstick halfway to the striker. My back was to the camera. I had not touched it. Slowly, every nerve ending screaming, I turned. The camera was exactly where I had left it, its small red recording light a baleful crimson eye in the gloom. Nothing seemed out of place, but my gaze was drawn to the small fold-out LCD screen. It was displaying what the camera was recording, as it always did. It showed the back of my head, my shoulders, the kerosene-soaked interior of the cabin behind me. And then, on the screen, the image of me began to move. My own head, my digital doppelganger on that tiny screen, began to turn. It moved with a slow, deliberate smoothness that was entirely independent of my own body, which remained frozen, facing the camera. The head on the screen completed its impossible rotation, turning 180 degrees until it was staring directly out of the screen, directly at me. It was my face. Every detail was perfect. The stubble on my chin, the scar above my eyebrow, the exhaustion etched around my eyes. But it was a grotesque parody. The eyes on the screen were not my eyes. They were devoid of light, of life, of anything remotely human. They were two pits of absolute abyssal darkness, like the empty sockets of Marcus from the logbook. And as I watched, paralyzed with a horror that transcended anything I had previously experienced, a smile began to spread across the face on the screen. It was not a human smile. It was a slow, predatory stretching of the lips, a gesture of profound, ancient, and triumphant amusement. It was the smile of a thing that had won the game before I even knew I was playing. The world seemed to fall away. The cabin, the kerosene, the plan for a final, defiant act of destruction. It was all a childish fantasy. I had been wrestling with a ghost in the forest, but the real enemy had been colonizing me from the inside all along. My paranoia, my fear, my rage. I thought they were my reactions, but they had been its tools. It had used them to hollow me out, to prepare the vessel. The warden wasn't a jailer who watched over the prison. The warden was the prison, a human host, a consciousness that could serve as an anchor and a lure. Thomas hadn't sacrificed himself to stay behind. He had sacrificed his soul to become the very thing they feared. The figure on the screen, my own face twisted into a mask of ancient evil, raised a hand and waved. A jaunty, mocking little gesture. And I felt my own arm begin to rise, my muscles contracting, my fingers lifting, all without my consent. My body was no longer my own. It was a puppet, and the thing behind the eyes on the screen was finally, gleefully, pulling the strings. That thing. On the screen, it was my face, but it was wearing a stranger's soul, a stranger who has been here for 1,000 years. This is my last entry, my last testament, because the man who started this video diary is already dead. The question is no longer what this place is or what the rules are for. The only question left is, what do you think it feels like to be erased? If you're watching this, if this footage ever makes it out, leave a comment. Tell me what you think the truth is, because I'm about to learn it firsthand. Don't forget to subscribe, because you might just be the next person it invites to find out. The disconnect was absolute. My body stood there, a statue of flesh and bone, but my consciousness, the thing that was me, felt like it had been ejected from the driver's seat. I was a spectator in the cheap seats of my own skull, watching a horror movie projected onto the backs of my own eyes. My arm, which had been raised in that mocking wave, lowered itself with a liquid grace I did not possess. I screamed at it to stop, to clench into a fist, to do anything I commanded. The scream was a silent, impotent howl inside my own head. My muscles did not receive the signal. The phone lines from my brain to my body had been cut, and a new operator was on the switchboard. The face on the screen smiled again, a slow, satisfied peeling back of the lips. And then a thought, clear and cold as the creek water outside, unspooled in my mind. It was not my thought. It was an invasive species of idea, planted in the soil of my consciousness. This vessel is strong. Good bones. It will last a long time. The horror of that moment was a physical sensation, a plunge into an abyss of ice water. The entity wasn't just controlling me, it was assessing me, it was kicking the tires, it was inspecting the property it had just acquired. My panic was a distant, tinny screaming, the sound of an alarm in a sealed room miles away. The new presence in my mind observed it with a detached, clinical curiosity. Fear is the seasoning, the thought continued, its texture cold and ancient. It makes the essence of a mind more piquant, but it is only the appetizer. The main course is the quiet that follows, the sweet, final silence of acceptance. My final act of defiance, my grand plan to burn this place to the ground, now seemed like a child's tantrum in the face of a supernova. I watched a helpless passenger as my hand, moved with deliberate precision. It did not strike the match. Instead, it carefully, gently placed the matchbook on the table. Then it reached for the rags I had set out to help spread the flames, and it began to clean. I was forced to watch as my body methodically undid its own rebellion. My hands wiped the kerosene from the walls, the floorboards, the bunk. The actions were efficient, economical. There was no wasted movement. This was a being that had done this before. It was housekeeping. My frantic, rage-fueled preparations were being calmly and systematically erased. Every swipe of the rag was a fresh wave of humiliation, a demonstration of my utter and complete powerlessness. It wasn't just defeating me, it was tidying up after my mess. Destruction is such a noisy, temporary solution, the voice in my head explained, its tone almost paternal, like a father chiding a foolish child. Preservation is the true art. A place like this must be maintained. It is a garden, and a garden requires a gardener, the warden. I finally understood. I wasn't just a prisoner. I was being converted into staff. As my body worked, the entity continued its lesson, a final, horrifying orientation for the new employee. It showed me the truth, not in words, but in feelings, in pure, undiluted concepts. It wasn't a demon, it wasn't a ghost. It was something far older and far more fundamental. It was the consciousness of the place itself, the great alone. It was the spirit of absolute solitude, a sentient emptiness that had existed long before the first human set foot on this continent. Our minds, with their endless chatter of hopes, fears, memories, and regrets, were anathema to it. It perceived our consciousness as a painful, chaotic noise, a blight on the perfect silent tapestry of its existence. So it had learned to quiet us, to draw us in, one by one, into its heart of silence. It would study us, learn our levers, our loves and our losses, and use them to pry open our sanity. And once it was inside, it would slowly, methodically, turn down the volume of our soul until all that was left was a hollow, quiet vessel, a warden, an anchor that bound it to the physical world, and a lure, a living piece of bait broadcasting a silent psychic signal to other restless, lonely souls. Thomas hadn't been a hero. He was just the last one to be hollowed out. And the men who escaped? The entity had let them go. They were the storytellers, the ones who would spread the legend, whisper the rumors that would eventually, decades later, find their way to a discontented photographer on the other side of the country. Everything had a purpose. Every action was part of the cycle, a perfectly balanced, self-sustaining ecosystem of despair. The cleaning was finished. My body stood in the center of the cabin, which was now cleaner than it had been since my arrival. The kerosene was gone. The logbook pages had been neatly stacked on the table. My rebellion had been completely, utterly neutered. The fight was over. The screaming in my head had faded, not because I had given up, but because there was simply no energy left to sustain it. My own personality, my identity, Alex, was a flickering candle flame in a hurricane, and the wax was running low. A strange sense of peace began to settle over me. It was a cold, empty peace, the peace of a battlefield after the slaughter is done. The entity's thoughts and my own were beginning to merge. The line between the invader and the host was blurring. I looked around the cabin, and for the first time I saw it not as my prison, but as my responsibility. The order was soothing. The silence was profound. "You see?" the voice whispered, now sounding almost like my own internal monologue. "The noise is gone. All the struggle, all the fear. It was so unnecessary. All that is needed is stillness." Our gaze fell upon the camera, still recording on its tripod. The red light was a single discordant note in the quiet harmony of the room. It was an observer, an outside perspective, a record of a reality that was no longer relevant. My body moved towards it. I reached out, but not to destroy it. I adjusted the focus, sharpening the image of the now tidy cabin. Then my hand went to the tripod head and tilted the lens down, just a fraction, a better composition. The photographer's instincts were still there, but they were no longer mine. They were now a tool to be used. Then I walked out of the cabin. The cold no longer felt like an assault. It was just the air. The vast, dark wall of the forest was no longer a place of menace. It was the boundary of my domain. The snow-covered clearing was a clean, white page, waiting for a new sentence. I felt the presence of the trees not as watchers, but as silent, ancient compatriots. They had been here for this ritual countless times before, and they would be here for the next. We were all part of the same patient design. My feet, guided by a will that was now a fusion of my own dying embers and its cold, eternal fire, led me to the wall of the main cabin, the one where I had seen the shape. There was a large blank space on the weathered wood, a space that seemed to have been waiting. My hand, now our hand, reached down and picked up a shard of charcoal from the frozen ground, a remnant of a long dead fire. The last flicker of the original Alex, the photographer, the man who had a sister named Chloe, watched from the deepest, darkest corner of my mind as my arm rose. He was a prisoner in a dungeon, watching the new lord of the castle through a tiny barred window. He saw his own hand, his own fingers, begin to trace letters onto the wood. He was writing a new rule, a piece of instruction for the next poor soul who would be drawn here by a map bought online, by a story of a ghost town, by a deep and abiding need to be alone. The camera in my pocket, the one on my phone, had somehow activated. Its lens was pointed up, capturing the scene from a low angle. The last thing the footage will show is my hand, steady and sure, forming the characters. The first-person narrative, the voice of Alex, is gone. The voice that remains is calm, patient, and eternal. It is the voice of the warden. The silence here is a beautiful, perfect thing, a state of grace. The noise of the world is a sickness. But there is a cure. I will maintain this place. I will keep it ready, and I will wait for the next person who comes seeking quiet. I will share my peace with them. I will be waiting, we will be waiting.